The city breathed like a wounded animal beneath a sky that had forgotten how to be honest. Neon banners rippled across skyscrapers, projecting the flawless smile of Homelander onto every glass surface, every bus stop, every screen suspended above the crowded streets. His image was everywhere, and yet the truth of him lived nowhere. Vought International had perfected the art of turning suffering into spectacle, and the world had grown obedient beneath the weight of that illusion. On a quiet rooftop far above the city, a man knelt with his hands raised. He had seen too much. He knew too many names, too many buried files, too many bodies that had never been reported. Homelander hovered before him, hands folded behind his back, his cape drifting in a wind that dared not touch him. There was no anger in his eyes, only boredom, only the certainty that no consequence would ever find him. A whisper of red light bloomed across the rooftop. The witness never finished his prayer. His body collapsed as smoke curled from a small crater in his chest, and Homelander adjusted his collar as though he had merely swatted an insect. He rose into the clouds without looking back, humming softly to himself, secure in the knowledge that the world would sleep peacefully because it had been told to. But the balance of things had shifted, quietly and terribly, in a place far beyond the reach of Vaught's cameras. In a dimension where the dead remembered every wound, a presence stirred. The spirit of vengeance had felt the weight of countless unpunished sins gathering in a single place, on a single earth, around a single soul that shone with the black brilliance of pride. It had felt murders unmourned, children silenced, truths incinerated. It had felt the laughter of a man who believed himself untouchable, and it had answered. Johnny Blaze awoke on cracked asphalt beneath a sky he did not recognize. Crimson lightning pulsed through the clouds, and the air tasted of ash and metal. He rose slowly, feeling the familiar heat crawl up his spine, the bones of his hand blackening beneath his skin. Somewhere in the distance, a billboard flickered, showing the face of a smiling god in a red, white, and blue uniform. Johnny stared at the image for a long moment. Then the fire rose. Flames burst from his skull in a slow, deliberate bloom, and the motorcycle beside him ignited into a chariot of hellfire. Ghost Rider had crossed the veil, and the world he entered had never known a justice that could not be bought. He rode through the night without hesitation. He did not need maps. He needed only the scent of guilt, and this earth reeked of it. In an alley behind a nightclub, 3 men who had trafficked girls for years found themselves paralyzed as a burning figure stepped from the smoke. In a penthouse where a senator counted the price of a murdered journalist, the windows shattered inward, and a chain of molten iron coiled around his throat. In a warehouse where a rogue Supe had crushed a family for sport, a single glance from those flaming eyes reduced the killer to a sobbing wreck confessing every crime he had ever committed. News traveled faster than Vought could bury it. Grainy phone footage spread across every network. A skeletal rider wrapped in fire, a voice like grinding stone. Criminals begging to be arrested rather than judged. Inside Vought Tower, analysts scrambled. Compound V had created many horrors, but nothing that walked outside the laboratory, nothing that answered to no corporation, nothing that could not be traced, controlled, or purchased. The 7 watched the footage in uneasy silence. Homelander laughed and called it a stunt, another attention-starved lunatic in a costume, and ordered the story suppressed. Somewhere on a lonely highway, Ghost Rider paused beside a burning cross of steel that had once been a getaway car. He turned his head slowly toward the distant lights of the city, and the fire around him seemed to lean forward with him. His voice was quiet, and yet it carried across the darkness like a verdict written into the bones of the world. Judgment has finally arrived. The nights that followed felt heavier than nights had any right to feel. Across the country, people began sleeping with their televisions on, half hoping to catch another glimpse of the burning rider, half afraid that he might one day pause outside their own windows. His path was not random. It never had been. He moved the way weather moves, drawn by pressure, guided by wounds too deep for the world to see. A cartel enforcer who had murdered an entire village woke to the sound of chains dragging across his ceiling. He was found the next morning kneeling in the town square, screaming the names of every soul he had taken, unable to stop until the police carried him away. A corrupt district attorney who had traded verdicts for envelopes of cash was discovered weeping in a church he had not entered since childhood, clutching a confession he had written by his own hand. A violent Supe who had crushed protesters at a rally the previous summer vanished from his gated estate, and only a scorched circle in the marble driveway remained to mark where he had stood. None of these events made sense to the men who tried to explain them. There was no ransom, no manifesto, no demand for airtime. Ghost Rider spoke only to the guilty and only long enough to force them to remember what they had tried to forget. When the guilt was too heavy for redemption, hellfire took what remained. When a thread of conscience still lived, he handed them to the law and vanished before anyone could thank him. Ordinary people began to whisper the word that Vought had spent decades trying to bury: justice. Not the manufactured kind sold in cereal boxes and stadium tours, but something older. Something that did not require permission. Billy Butcher watched the footage from a dim room thick with cigarette smoke and stale beer. He had spent years chasing the same monsters, and every victory had cost him a piece of himself. Yet here was a stranger doing in a single night what he had bled for across a lifetime. There were no press conferences, no merchandise, no carefully arranged photographs. Only a hooded figure riding away from ruins that had once housed the untouchable. Butcher lit another cigarette with hands that would not quite hold still, and for the first time in years he allowed himself the dangerous luxury of hope. Inside Vought Tower, Homelander stood before a wall of monitors and forced a smile that no one dared to question. He mocked the writer for the cameras, calling him a burnt-out cosplayer, a desperate freak begging for relevance, a footnote already fading from the news cycle. The Seven laughed on cue. The public relations team applauded the delivery, and then Homelander returned to his private suite and stared at the same footage for hours in absolute silence. He could not understand it. His heat vision had melted tanks. His voice had bent presidents. His reputation alone had emptied city blocks. Yet none of it seemed to reach the burning man. Ghost Rider did not tremble when Homelander's name was spoken. He did not flinch at the sound of jets or the sight of the Vought emblem. He did not even look toward the tower. He simply continued his work, unhurried, patient, absolute. The absence of fear in another creature was something Homelander had never truly encountered. Fear was the currency he understood best. Fear told him where he stood in a room. Fear told him he was still a god. Without it, he was suddenly, unbearably, only a man in a costume. Deep beneath the city, in a chapel Ghost Rider had chosen for reasons only he understood. Johnny Blaze sat with his elbows resting on his knees, and the fire quieted to a low ember around his shoulders. He did not curse Homelander. He did not threaten him. He did not send messages through intermediaries. He simply waited, the way a storm waits behind a mountain, gathering weight, choosing its hour. Outside the chapel, a woman lit a candle for a son who had disappeared into one of Vaught's programs and never returned. She did not know the burning man was inside. She only knew that, for the first time in years, the darkness beyond the door felt less like an enemy, and more like a promise finally being kept. Vought Tower had been designed to feel eternal. Its glass rose like a monument to certainty, engineered to convince every visitor that the people inside could not be reached, could not be questioned, could not be undone. On the night Ghost Rider chose to enter, that illusion lasted less than a minute. The security grid failed floor by floor, not with alarms, but with silence. Cameras turned to static. Biometric locks glowed red and then went dark. Reinforced doors softened at their hinges, as if the metal itself had grown tired of pretending. A single set of footprints burned into the marble of the lobby, each one deeper than the last, and the night watchman who had guarded that floor for 11 years dropped his radio and knelt without knowing why. Executives who had spent their careers laughing off consequences met Ghost Rider one by one in their private offices. He did not raise his voice. He did not raise a hand. He only stood in the doorway with fire curling from his skull, and the guilt they had spent decades burying rose in their throats like bile. Some fainted. Some confessed into their own recorders before he even asked. One vice president, a man who had personally approved the disposal of test subjects, walked to the window and pressed his palm against the glass, as though begging the city outside to remember he had once been a child. In the deepest archive, beneath layers of concrete and legal fiction, Johnny Blaze found the truth, files marked with names of children, ledgers of villages erased for corporate convenience, recordings of screams cataloged like inventory. Compound V had never been a miracle. It had been a harvest. Every celebrated Supe on every billboard had been paid for in suffering that Vought had priced, packaged, and forgotten. Johnny closed the last folder gently, as if setting down something sacred. The fire around him did not roar. It grieved. High above, in a penthouse that had been built to feel like a throne room, Homelander began to come apart. He paced the length of his suite in tight, twitching circles, muttering to reflections that no longer flattered him. He shouted at aides who had done nothing wrong and struck a wall hard enough to leave a crater shaped like his fist. He had ruled through fear for so long that he had forgotten how to exist without it. And now there was a creature in his building who would not give him the tribute of a single trembling breath. The seven fractured in the silence he left behind. A train drank alone and would not answer his phone. The deep wept in a bathtub, pleading with fish that could not forgive him. Black Noir stood motionless in a corridor for 6 hours, then walked out of Vought Tower and never returned. Starlight found herself smiling in the dark, ashamed of the smile and unable to stop it, whispering into her pillow that perhaps someone had finally come who could not be bribed, blackmailed, or bought. Maeve, exhausted beyond speech, poured a drink, raised it toward the burning skyline, and murmured that if this was the end of them, she would meet it sober enough to see it clearly. In an abandoned dockyard, Billy Butcher met Ghost Rider face to face. He had rehearsed 100 speeches on the way there, and every one of them died in his mouth. The burning figure did not threaten him. It simply listened. Butcher heard himself for once, without the armor of his own voice, and what he heard frightened him more than any Superman ever had. He asked, hoarsely, whether the rider would kill Homelander. Johnny Blaze answered from within the fire, his voice quieter than Butcher expected, and heavier than he was prepared to carry. Vengeance without justice becomes another form of evil. Butcher stared at him for a long time. Then he nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when he realizes he has been walking in the wrong direction his entire life. Somewhere above them, the lights of Vought Tower flickered as another server surrendered its secrets to the world. And in his penthouse, Homelander finally understood, with a terror he could not name, that the confrontation he had been avoiding was no longer something he could postpone. The sky over New York City turned the color of old blood long before the sun had any right to set. Weather stations could not explain it. Pilots reported turbulence in cloudless air. Birds abandoned the skyline in silent, uneven waves. On rooftops across the boroughs, people stepped outside without knowing why, drawn by a pressure in the chest that felt older than language. Something enormous was arriving, and every living thing sensed it before any camera did. Homelander struck first, because he did not know how else to begin. He came down from the clouds like a falling sun, fists extended, mouth curled into the smile he wore whenever he needed to remind himself that he was still the strongest thing in the world. The blow that met Ghost Rider would have vaporized a battleship. It did not vaporize the rider. It did not move him. Hellfire wrapped around Homelander's arms and held them there, gently, the way a parent might hold the wrists of a raging child. He tore himself free and unleashed everything at once. Heat vision cut through steel and stone for blocks in every direction. Supersonic strikes shattered the windows of a dozen skyscrapers. He howled a rage that had been building for years, and the sound rolled across the city like a storm losing its mind. Ghost Rider absorbed it all without stepping back. The flames around him only grew brighter, fed by each attack, drinking the violence as if it had been offered in tribute. Homelander realized, somewhere between the third and fourth impact, that he could not win by breaking things. Nothing in him had ever prepared him for that thought. His whole life had been a corridor of shattered obstacles, and now there stood an obstacle that refused to shatter. He began to strike wildly, without pattern, the way frightened men strike when they can no longer pretend to be gods. Ghost Rider still did not answer. He waited, patient as gravity, until the storm inside Homelander began to tire. Then the chains came. They rose from the pavement as though the city itself had been holding them in reserve, links of molten iron threaded with runes older than any language spoken above the ground. They wrapped Homelander's ankles first, then his wrists, then his throat, and no matter how he strained, no matter how brightly his eyes burned, the chains only tightened. He was pulled down out of the sky, slowly, deliberately, until his knees met the asphalt of a street he had once flown above without a thought. The world watched. Every network, every phone, every stranger leaning out of a window with trembling hands. Vaught's sensors tried to cut the feeds and found that their signals no longer belonged to them. This transmission would not be edited. Ghost Rider stepped forward. He did not gloat. He did not accuse. He simply lowered himself until the empty sockets of his burning skull were level with Homelander's eyes. And then he looked. The Penance Stare was not a weapon. It was a mirror. Homelander felt his own gaze pulled inward, past the polished smile, past the practiced speeches, past the childhood he had spent so many years pretending not to remember. He saw the laboratory. He saw the men who had made him and the woman who had feared him. He saw the first life he had taken, and the second, and the 100th, and he could no longer count them because they had come too quickly, too easily. He felt the terror of a father who had shielded his daughter with a body that could not shield anything. He felt the grief of a mother who had waited by a phone that would never ring. He felt the confusion of a child who had trusted a smiling hero right up until the moment that hero had decided the child was inconvenient. Every scream, every prayer, every quiet, private ending he had inflicted while adjusting his cape for the cameras. He felt all of it at once, without interruption, without the merciful blur of distance. For the first time in his life, Homelander wept, and the weeping was not performance. It was not calculation. It was the sound of a man discovering, far too late, that he had been carrying a graveyard inside his chest. His screams rose above the ruined avenues and shook windows for miles. Reporters stopped speaking mid-sentence. Soldiers lowered their rifles. In a small apartment in Queens, a widow who had lost her husband to a stray blast from that same red, white, and blue figure sank to the floor and covered her face, unable to decide whether she was witnessing revenge or something stranger, something almost holy. When at last the fire released him, Homelander collapsed forward, forehead pressed to the pavement, sobs breaking out of him in waves he did not know how to stop. Ghost Rider did not kill him. He turned, mounted his burning chariot, and rode into the dimming red sky, leaving behind a broken god and a watching world, both of them forced, at last, to choose what they would do with the truth. Morning came slowly to a city that no longer knew what it was. The red had drained from the sky at some point in the night, and by dawn there was only a pale, exhausted blue, as though the heavens themselves needed rest. Smoke still rose from the wreckage of a dozen blocks, but the fires had gone quiet, and the sirens that wailed through the streets carried a different tone than they had the day before. They were not chasing chaos anymore. They were beginning to answer questions that had been asked in silence for decades. Vought Tower emptied itself of secrets by the hour. Every server that had survived the night sang its confession into the hands of journalists who had been waiting years for such a signal. Names appeared on public feeds that had once been protected by armies of lawyers. Executives who had ordered assassinations tried to board private jets and found that their pilots had already spoken to prosecutors. By nightfall, cameras captured a line of them being led from the lobby in cuffs, blinking against the flashbulbs, no longer certain how to arrange their faces. Secret laboratories burned in 3 states, not by hellfire, but by the more ordinary flame of citizens who had finally recognized what had been built next door to their schools. Governments that had spent years pretending to regulate Vought scrambled to announce hearings, commissions, oversight boards. Some were sincere, some were theater. It no longer mattered as much as it once had because the public had begun to distinguish between the two. The 7, as a name, ceased to mean anything. A train checked himself into a rehabilitation clinic under his true first name and asked the receptionist to hide the paperwork. The Deep vanished into a coastal town and was later seen releasing captured dolphins from a marine park at 3 a.m. Maeve walked away entirely, taking with her a woman she had loved in secret for years, refusing every interview offered on their doorstep. Starlight did not disappear. She stood in the ruins of a neighborhood that had been half destroyed during the battle and lifted rubble with her bare hands beside men and women whose names she would learn later. She stayed for weeks. She slept in shelters. She listened more than she spoke. When a child asked her whether she was still a hero, she answered that she was still trying to become one. And the answer traveled further than any speech she had ever given from a stage. Billy Butcher struggled in ways he had not expected. He had wanted an execution. He had wanted a body. He had wanted the final period at the end of a sentence he had been writing since the day his wife was taken from him. Instead, he had been given a verdict without a corpse. and it sat in his chest like a stone he could not swallow. Johnny Blaze found him on a pier at the edge of the city, staring at water that reflected nothing worth keeping. He did not sit down. He did not touch him. He only spoke, quietly, as men speak to other men who are close to falling. True justice, he said, allows every soul the chance to choose a different path, even the ones who will not take it, especially those, because if we take the choice away, we make ourselves the thing we hunted. Butcher did not answer for a long time. Then he laughed once, softly, without humor, and said that he hated how much sense that made. Across the world, in kitchens and classrooms and crowded buses, people began to speak of power in a different tone. Children asked their parents harder questions. Parents, for once, tried to answer them honestly. Congregations prayed with less certainty and more attention. Neighbors greeted neighbors they had not spoken to in years. Hope did not arrive in a single moment. It arrived the way tides arrive, in small, patient rises, each one leaving the shore a little changed. Fear had ruled for a long time. It was not gone. It might never be entirely gone. But somewhere in the ordinary hours of an ordinary week, the world remembered that fear had never been the only thing capable of holding people together, and it began, cautiously, to lean towards something better. There is a particular kind of quiet that follows the collapse of a great lie. It is not peace. It is closer to the hush that settles over a room after a long argument, when everyone still present understands that nothing said afterward can matter as much as what has already been spoken. That was the quiet in which Homelander lived now. He had not been imprisoned. There was no cell that could have held him. He had not been executed. There was no court on earth willing to claim the authority. He had simply been left, and being left was, for him, a punishment more precise than any sentence. He wandered without cape or emblem through the outer edges of towns he had once flown above without seeing. He wore a coat too heavy for the weather. He kept his eyes low. He could still have leveled a city with a glance, and yet he flinched at the sound of a car horn, because every sudden noise brought back a face from the Penance Stare, and every face carried a name he had never bothered to learn. Eventually his footsteps found the place he had been avoiding, a quiet field outside the city where a lone chapel of scorched stone stood against a sky that had returned, finally, to an ordinary gray. Ghost Rider waited on the steps, the fire dimmed to something almost gentle. Johnny Blaze visible within the flames like a man seen through the mouth of a furnace. Homelander did not kneel. He was not yet ready for that. But he stopped at the base of the steps, and his voice, when it came, was smaller than any voice the world had ever heard from him. "Can someone like me," he asked, "ever be forgiven?" Johnny did not answer quickly. He looked at him for a long moment, and in that moment Homelander felt the strange, unfamiliar sensation of being seen without being measured for use. "Forgiveness," Johnny said at last, "is never earned by power. It is not granted by fear. It begins the day you accept the weight of your own sins and stop asking the world to carry them for you. Whether it ever finishes is not for me to say. It is not even for you to say. It is only for you to keep walking toward." Homelander closed his eyes. He did not promise anything. He was not ready to promise. But he did not turn away either, and that, for a man who had spent his entire life turning away, was its own kind of beginning. Elsewhere, in a small house with a garden he had never expected to keep, Billy Butcher stood over a kitchen sink and stared at his own reflection in a darkened window. He had spent so many years perfecting his hatred that he had forgotten what his face looked like without it. He saw for the first time how much of Homelander he had allowed to live inside himself. He saw the cost of becoming the thing you swore to destroy. He turned off the tap. He dried his hands. And he made himself a promise, quietly, that he would not honor his dead by feeding them more of the same darkness that had taken them. The spirit of vengeance felt the shift, faint as a breath, real as sunrise. Its work on this earth was drawing toward its end. Not because every sinner had repented, but because the choice had been placed, at last, back into human hands, where it had always belonged. Months passed, and the world learned to breathe again in a rhythm it had almost forgotten. Superheroes still existed, but they were no longer worshipped. Their faces still appeared on screens, but the screens were smaller now, and the cheers were quieter, and the questions asked afterward were sharper than any question that had been asked before. Oversight boards convened in daylight. Contracts were rewritten in public. Children were taught, gently, that courage was not the same as costume. and that admiration should never come without accountability. Homelander was not seen for a long time. Then, in a small mountain town, a man with tired eyes was said to have carried an injured hiker down a difficult trail without giving his name. In a coastal village half a world away, a stranger in a plain coat was said to have stood between a frightened family and a group of men who meant them harm, and then walked away before anyone could thank him. The stories were never confirmed. Some believed he was seeking redemption. Some believed he was only hiding from himself in a shape that resembled it. Perhaps both were true. Perhaps that was where redemption always began, in the narrow space between the two. Starlight founded no organization. She joined many. She learned the names of the volunteers who cooked in shelters. She testified in hearings that lasted for months. She refused every offer to return to a stage. Billy Butcher, against every expectation he had ever held about himself, found quiet. He did not become gentle. He simply stopped confusing rage with love. And on a lonely road at the edge of a country that had once forgotten what justice looked like, a lone rider paused before a shimmer in the air that only he could see. The flames around him had softened. The chains hung loose. The night sky above was almost tender. Johnny. Blaze looked back at the world he was preparing to leave. He thought of the man he had judged and had not killed. He thought of the woman who had chosen service over spectacle. He thought of the hunter who had learned to lower his weapon. He thought of the countless faces, unnamed and unknown, who had begun to speak up in small rooms and quiet streets because they had seen, once, what true justice looked like, and had decided that they could no longer live without offering some small portion of it themselves. He spoke aloud, though no one but the wind was there to hear him. Justice is not measured by how many enemies fall. It is measured by how many souls are given the chance to rise. He rode forward. The rift opened. The fire around him bent toward it, eager to return home. And in the last instant before he crossed, in a distant city he would never see again, an ordinary woman on an ordinary evening pulled a stranger away from the path of an oncoming truck. She had no powers. She had no cape. She had only witnessed, once, on a screen in her kitchen, a burning figure lower himself to look a false god in the eye. She had never forgotten what she had seen. She never would. The spirit of vengeance disappeared into the dark, and the dark, for once, did not feel empty. It felt lit from within, as though the fire had chosen to remain, quietly, in the hearts of the people it had left behind. Fear had ruled for a long time. Fear had ended, and in its place, softer than flame and stronger than judgment, hope had begun to walk the earth on ordinary feet.